Yeah.
Mr. Sigler.
Yes, sir. Have you said anything, Ron, with regard to the ITT in Chile? How did you handle
the State Department dealt with that today.
Oh, they did?
Yes, sir.
What did they do? Deny it?
They denied it, but they were cautious on how they dealt with the Corey statement because they were afraid that might backfire.
What did Corey say?
Well, Corey said that he had received instructions to do anything short of a Dominican-type, alleged to have said that.
Corey did?
Right.
So how'd that get out? He put that out?
Declassified White House records show President Nixon ordered the CIA to make the economy scream in Chile to stop a left-wing government in 1970. Half a century later, the battleground hasn't disappeared, it's just gone quiet. The new fight isn't tanks, it's contracts, and one country undercutting another as China and the US fight a silent war for Latin America. American companies are leaning on Washington to screen Chinese tech, stall ports concessions, and weaponize tariffs. Yet, China keeps advancing with fast financing, BRI concrete, and mine-to-battery deals. That's why the United States is stepping in harder, tightening trade measures, pushing nearshoring, and contesting who writes the rules. Latin America is the prize because it's the supply spine of the next economy. The lithium triangle that sets EVs costs, copper that powers grids and data centers, soy and beef that feed China's cities, and Pacific megaports and canals that shave days off shipping. Control the contracts here, and you don't just win influence, you set prices on cars, food, and electricity for the rest of the hemisphere. My name is Dr. David Oualaalou, and you are watching Geopolitics and Money. Follow the money, decodes the world. First, let's look at the historical pillar of control, Monroe Doctrine and financial leverage. In 1823, President James Monroe articulated a bold geopolitical vision that the Western Hemisphere represented a distinct sphere of influence for the United States, off limit to new European colonial ventures. This principle, known as the Monroe Doctrine, declared that any European intervention in the Americas will be seen as hostile to the United States' interests, effectively positioning the US as both guardian and regional authority. While initially primarily rhetorical, it evolved into actionable policy. Nearly a century later, Theodore Roosevelt's corollary repurposed this doctrine to justify preemptive US interventions, particularly when Latin American nations defaulted on debt. The US explicitly positioned itself as the compulsory stabilizer, intervening militarily as a form of dollar diplomacy to protect economic interests and enforce repayments, such as in the Dominican Republic and Nicaragua.
All right, guys, real quick. Before we get into this story, I've got to tell you about something that's flying under the radar right now, but it shouldn't be. While the mainstream media is busy running their mouths about Trump and pushing every culture war distraction they can think of, something far more important is happening behind the scenes involving a company called Western Star Resources. Gold just hit an all-time high, and silver is back to levels we haven't seen since 2011. And yeah, that's with a strong dollar and rising treasury yields. Normally that pushes gold down, but this time, gold's breaking out. Why? Because big money sees what's coming. Economic slowdown, Fed rate cuts, global instability, and they're looking for safety. President Trump made his position clear on Truth Social, with direct support from the White House, supporting the gold market and said it straight up. Gold will not be tariffed. So investors are increasing their gold allocations. They know what's up. Now look, y'all know I'm all about building financial independence. I don't trust the system, and you probably don't either. That's why I think it's worth looking at Western Star Resources. They're a junior gold exploration company working in North America, not some big bloated corporation. They're lean, they're early, and they're out there looking for the next big gold discovery. In a gold bull market, these are the kinds of plays that can really move. And if gold keeps climbing like the experts say it will, companies like Western Star could benefit in a major way. Could a huge US expansion plan be on the cards? Let's just say in a market like this, Western Star could be positioning itself for growth in the US. I wouldn't bet against them or that plan. Of course, do your own research. I am not a financial advisor. I'm just saying, don't wait for CNN or MSNBC to tell you this stuff is happening. By the time they do, the opportunity's already gone. So if you're into gold and silver or just want to learn more about the companies that could benefit from all of this, check out Western Star Making Gold and Silver Great Again. I will drop a link down below. Now, back to the show.
Economic control, debt, and the IMF. Fast forward to the late 20th century. The United States, while leveraging international financial institutions such as the IMF, played a pivotal role in shaping Latin America's economies through structural adjustments programs. As countries bogged down by ballooning debts entered crisis, the IMF extended loans under stringent conditions, demanding privatization, fiscal austerity, and deregulation. These structural adjustments often prioritized international creditors' interests and opened local markets to US and global firms, undercutting national sovereignty. In the late 1980s, heavily indebted Latin American nations accepted new debt frameworks like Brady bonds issued in cooperation with the US Treasury to restructure unsustainable debt, though often at the cost of a long-term economic independence. These financial leverages functioned similarly to prior interventionist policies, reinforcing US influence over the region by controlling the credit lifeline of entire economies. Now let's cover China's soaring trade with Latin America. Over the past 2 decades, trade between China and Latin America has grown from a modest $18 billion to a staggering $450 billion by 2024. A meteoric rise reflecting China's hunger for raw materials and Latin America's search for new markets beyond traditional Western partners. This boom was especially dramatic in 2000. Latin America accounted for less than 2% of China's trade. Yet by early 2020, it had ballooned into an economic juggernaut, with the trade growing at approximately 31% annually in the early years. According to economists, by 2023, two-way trade has surged to around $489 billion, representing roughly 8.2% of China's total trade volume, underscoring Latin America's elevated strategic significance to China's global economic ambitions. This rapid growth has been powered largely by Chinese demand for Latin America's commodities, soybeans, oil, copper, and other raw materials. In return, Latin American economies imported manufactured and higher value added goods from China, creating a trade relationship that reinforces traditional raw material for finished goods dynamics. Brazil, for instance, has seen its soybean exports to China nearly doubled, evolving from a roughly $20 billion in 2017 to nearly $50 billion in 2025. This trend is visible across the region, as Latin American exporter states supply agricultural and extractive products to fuel Chinese industry while importing machinery, electronics, and manufactured goods, cementing a structurally asymmetrical trade patterns. Next, it's important to cover infrastructure investments and Belt on a Road Initiative expansion. China has significantly ramped up its presence in Latin America's infrastructure, offering major stakes via Belt on a Road or BRI-backed projects. In 2024, Chinese-sponsored BRI engagement reached a high of around $70.7 billion in construction contracts and $51 billion in investments, including a record-breaking $9.7 billion in green energy sectors like wind and solar. Additionally, China has pledged up to $250 billion in investments over the next decade for the region, covering critical infrastructure needs while expanding strategic influence. Through the China-CELAC cooperation platform, Beijing supports multiple development financing instruments such as the China-LAC Infrastructure Special Loan, placing itself as the leading financier for regional mega projects. But what about loans and debt diplomacy? Beijing lending model, dominated by state-backed banks like the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank, has reached into Latin America with over $138 billion in loans between 2005 and 2020, reshaping regional finances and tying national developments to Chinese terms. Critics argue this is a classic debt trap diplomacy. Loans often comes with opaque terms, repayment burdens are heavy, and when countries fall behind, Beijing can leverage its possession for strategic influence, similar to what some analysts point to in Sri Lanka's Hambantota port deal. However, in 2022, Sri Lanka defaulted on its external debt amounting to around $46 billion, triggering its worst economic crisis in post-independence history. The collapse led to soaring inflation, shortages of food, fuel, and medicine, and a GDP contraction of 7.3% in 2022 and 2.3% in 2023. Later that year, Sri Lanka announced an agreement with China EXIM, which is Export-Import Bank, to delay payments on about $4.2 billion worth of loans to Chinese lenders extended to the country. If you would like to know more about whether China is a debt trap in developing nations using loans, we have an entire show on it. Check it out here. Another critical part of this equation is technology and digital infrastructure. China's push into Latin America's digital realm is gaining pace through the digital Silk Road, offering 5G networks, data infrastructures, fiber optics, and satellite systems, often via tech giants like Huawei and ZTE. These firms provide cost-effective connectivity solutions, but critics argue the infrastructure embeds pathways for surveillance and data access tied to the Chinese government mandates. Securing telecommunication infrastructure also enhances China's geopolitical leverage by integrating digital governance and surveillance capabilities into the region's critical network. China also has strategic multilateral engagements beyond bilateral engagements. China deepens its standing through multilateral platforms like China-CELAC Forum, which fosters political dialogue, trade, science, and infrastructure cooperation, with over 100 initiatives launched across sectors like agriculture, technology transfer, and law enforcement. Beijing has also integrated into once Western-dominated institutions as an active participant in the Organization of American States, known as OAS, and Inter-America Development Bank, IDB, and launched development funds like the China-LAC Cooperation Fund to boost financial integration and influence. On to the U.S. influence in Latin America. Over the years, the United States has declassified regime changes to protect markets and assets. A consistent through line of U.S. policy has been removing or weakening governments seen as hostile to U.S. commercial interests, especially when they threatened to nationalize resources or reorient trade. In Guatemala in 1954, the CIA operation PB Success backed the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz after land and labor reform collided with the United Fruits interests. The declassified CIA history and the State Department's Foreign Relations of the United States cables provide primary documentation of the operations planning and political economic context. In Chile, between 1970 and 1973, declassified record shows President Nixon ordered efforts to make the economy scream to prevent the unseat Salvador Allende, explicitly linking economic pressure to political change. Church Committee materials and FRUS notes captures the order and the breadth of covered actions. But how has the United States used debt, crisis, and structural adjustments as policy levers? Following the 1980s debt crisis, the region's lost decade is known. Countries turned to the IMF and World Bank for balance of payments support tied to structural adjustments, privatization, fiscal austerity and deregulations, and trade financial liberalization. Even IMF and Federal Reserve histories emphasize how debt dynamics forced policy conditionally across the region. The effect? Faster opening to foreign capitals and commodity export reliance, but persistence underinvestments in domestic industry and social protection. And of course, we have to cover the Trump tariffs. In his second term, President Trump has leaned hard into tariffs-first policy, layering universal and sector-specific duties on top of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, while scrapping Biden's-era regional frameworks. In April of this year, the White House invoked the Internal Emergency Economic Power Act to establish a 10% baseline reciprocal tariffs on most imports, with carve-outs for items already covered by Section 232, auto parts, etc. USMCA, United States, Mexico, Canada, compliant North American goods remain duty-free under that order. Non-USMCA compliant Mexico goods face 25%, and separate 232 auto duties sits on the top for covered products. The administration also ended the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity and signaled a pivot back to an America CREASE 2.0 investments nearshoring posture while preparing the 2026 USMCA review. Through 2025, the White House used tariff threats to press Mexico on migration, fentanyl, and industrial policy. After floating broad new tariffs early in the year, the administration announced an additional 30% tariffs on all Mexican imports on July 12th, then suspended it for 90 days from August 1st following a bilateral understanding while keeping in place existing 25% on non-USMCA compliant goods, 50% on steel, aluminum, and 25% on auto parts. The same period also saw a hard enforcement actions outside USMCA. Commerce terminated the long-running tomato suspension agreement and issued an anti-dumping duty order, which was generally about 17.09% on Mexican fresh tomatoes, with duties effective mid-July. These moves raised direct costs in multiple Mexican export lines, even as USMCA preferences endure for compliant goods. EVs, a backdoor for China. Beyond Mexico-only actions, 232 auto parts measures and the administration's stance on Chinese EVs routed via Mexico chilled planned Chinese auto investments. Reporting indicates firms like BYD shelved Mexico plans aimed at the tariff climate and policy uncertainty, reinforcing the administration's goal to block Chinese brand vehicles from leveraging USMCA access. None of this matters without the battleground industrial sector, especially critical minerals like lithium triangle. China has moved fast to lock in the lithium triangle: Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. Argentina has tripled lithium carbonate capacity in the last 2 years and keeps approving new projects, while Bolivia signed a $1 billion deal with a Chinese consortium led by Cattle to build DLE plants at Uni. Together with Chile's vast reserves, this cements Chinese supply chain leverage from mine to battery. Also, ports and logistics, control of checkpoints, and throughout, rising via Casco's Chance megaport in Peru, soft launched in late 2024 and built as the Pacific hub that shortened Asia-South America routes, now under Peruvian price control that Casco is contesting. The project underscores how port ownership becomes strategic infrastructure for China, as well as energy, oil and power grids. Beyond oil, for loans with Venezuela, roughly $50 billion since 2007, later reworked as prices crashed. Chinese capital has surged into Brazil's grid and renewable, from state grids, multi-billion transmissions built out to SPIC, solar projects, backed by new cooperation with the New Development Bank. Energy remains a pillar where China pairs commodity offtake with long-lived infrastructure. And agriculture, China's demand has rewired soy trade. Brazil now supplies the lion's share of China's import, about 71% in 2024, and 2025 purchase patterns show Beijing booking Brazilian beans into the U.S. window, pushing U.S. exporters out despite price advantages and highlighting the geopolitical durability of the Brazil-China farm corridor. And finally, telecom and digital infrastructure, fiber, 5G, and data center. Huawei and other Chinese vendors anchor much of Latin America's mobile core and backhaul, despite U.S. warnings over security risks. Countries continue adopting Chinese 5G and cloud gear, embedding Beijing's digital standards alongside hard infrastructure and creating long-term switching costs that translate into political leverage. In conclusion, in the end, Latin America isn't a battleground so much as a balancing table, and its leaders are the ones dealing the cards. The United States still leans on old advantages, security ties, finance standards, and sanctions, USMCA leverage, while rebranding them for a new era. China offers speed, ports, grids, 5G, minerals wrapped in promises of growth with fewer political strings. Will Washington or Beijing lock countries into commodity dependence or finance the hard climb into value-added industry, digital sovereignty, and resilient supply chains? Over the next few years, through the USMCA 2026 review, lithium build-outs, and the spread of Chinese digital rail, the rules will be written not in think tanks, papers, but in contracts, ports, and codes. Thanks for watching. And we want to give a shout out to our Patreon members. If you want to join our Patreon to support our work and get exclusive content, check it out at patreon.com/GPIC. And remember, follow the money, decode the world. Thank you.